Okay, it says we're in progress, folks. At least I've got witnesses. I want to welcome you to the webinar today. We're feeling pretty good. We're feeling fall. I'm Nancy Phillips, coordinator of the Illinois Family Resource Center. And you'll see Christina Banda's name on here. She's with us. She's the education coordinator that's based out of Chicago with the Resource Center. She's the wonderful sidekick that I have. Um, I just want to do a couple of things before we get started and I turn it over to Megan. We would like to please ask you to give us 2 to 3 weeks to get the certificates out when we're done. And the other thing is to get your certificates, you need to stay because we have to check the attendance for each person. And if there's some reason you have to leave, send me an email or something and we'll see what we can do to evaluate that because we don't want you to lose your CEUs, but we also have to be honest with them for the validity of the whole process. So I just really welcome you. I see names of people that are on here a lot, and I see new names, and I am just really excited for you all being here. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Megan in just a minute. She's going to do parental substance use and children impacted by addiction, a deep dive into a complex challenge. And I've heard her do this the first time she did it, and it's great. And I just think that what she has done is incredible. Plus, she's a fun person. But she is the executive director of CIRAC, which is the Southern Illinois Resource and Advocacy Center, that she opened a year, just a little over a year ago. And the success of this place for Southern Illinois and for the impact for the whole state of Illinois is incredible. So, Megan, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Miss Nancy. That was I'm usually not very comfortable with introductions, but that one I appreciate. Thank you so much. Like Nancy said, my name is Megan Ragan. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm the executive director of the Southern Illinois Resource and Advocacy Center. Like Nancy said, usually at this point in a presentation, I say, if you haven't heard of us, it's okay. We're new. We still are new, but like Nancy said, we have been open now a little bit over a year. And so I just have to say the journey of this last year has been wild, like 98% of the time. But it has also just really kind of fueled my passion. And now this wonderful team that I work with, it has fueled all of our passions for helping support families who are going through some really difficult circumstances. So as we get into today's content, I want to first acknowledge that this can be a really difficult topic, right? No one likes to think about the fact that we have children across our communities, across our state, that are growing up in homes where addiction is a major factor. No one likes to think about that. No one likes to, that doesn't sit comfortably with any of us. But unfortunately, oh no, I saw an eye froze. Am I froze? Am I froze? Am I okay? Okay. Woo! Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Okay. So unfortunately, this is a challenge that we have to face. So like Nancy said, I have given this presentation several times across different venues. But until about 15 minutes ago, I was in it changing things. So every time you see it, hopefully if you've seen it before, this will be a little bit new. So getting into today, I wanted to first give a little bit of information about myself, because I think that is important to know whenever it comes to my perspectives on these things. Okay, I'm a firm believer that we are all the sum of our experiences. Every person that is in this Zoom, every person that you see on the street, that you see whenever you go through and get your Starbucks pumpkin spice latte in the morning, every person you work with, we are all walking around as the sum of our experiences. While that is a beautiful thing, it can also kind of everything, right? And so that's where we have to have a lot of grace and compassion for ourselves and for our fellow human beings. Some things about me that really have shaped who I am as a person, and as well as my perspective and approach on this challenge is I am a lifelong resident of one of the most rural communities of Illinois, Gallatin County. If you've heard of it, we are all the way down south, and I'm talking like 3-4 hours south of Springfield. So we're way down there. The county that I have lived and I grew up in and have lived here my entire life, we have less than 5,000 people. We are a very poor community. We have a lot of folks that are impacted by generational poverty, generational trauma, generational substance use. And I have to, I always like to kind of give this information because um, pretty much how I approach almost everything that I do in this work is through that rural perspective, right? So you're going to hear me talk about that a lot today, and I apologize, but that is just how my brain works. Secondly, I have been doing this for over a decade, which is wild to think and makes me feel a little bit old, but that's okay because I have learned a lot of hard lessons, but very important lessons as I have been doing this. It has been, I've learned things through my personal experiences with family members, friends, colleagues that have struggled with some of these challenges, and also learned things in the different professional capacities that I've served in over the last decade. And then lastly, one of the things that I am most proud of is that I am a supervisor of a team of peer support specialists. If you aren't sure what a peer support specialist is, you will know by the end of this presentation. But these folks have taught me more about this subject, about working with our communities and how to support families in a way that is actually impactful than really my any college class for my master's degree ever did. And that is just one of the values of that lived experience. Getting into some of the CIRAC values, and again, I promise this is relevant to this presentation because again, this shapes how I approach things and how we approach this challenge as an organization who is trying to foster change in our communities. First thing is that we focus on supporting those short-term needs and the long-term goals of participants. Now, you may say, well, isn't that kind of the goal of every organization, every agency? Yes, absolutely. It should be, right? But when I say that we focus on the short-term needs, I mean, we literally, when we meet with people, one of the first things that we ask them is, are you hungry? Do you have food at home? Do you, have stable housing? Are you in a spot where you feel like you're safe, where you feel like you can protect your children, you can protect yourself? We are very Maslow's oriented, where we focus on those basic needs before we start to push towards those long-term goals that are good for our families. Second thing is that people with lived experience, or PLE, are at the center of all of our programming. I am, like I said, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, but when it comes to our programming, not just how the program is delivered, but also in how the programming is shaped and developed, we take the advice of our people with lived experience on staff. There is no better person to explain to us how to support a parent who is navigating addiction than a person with lived experience who has been a parent navigating addiction, right? So that makes sure that all of our services, all of our programming are grounded in lived experience and empathy. And then last, we use a harm reduction approach for everything. Oftentimes, people tend to kind of lump this concept of harm reduction underneath, the umbrella of substance use disorders, and it absolutely is, right? Like traditionally, that is where we think of harm reduction. But whenever we look at the true meaning behind harm reduction, that any and every positive change is a milestone to be celebrated, we're able to apply that across a lot of different sectors and fields. We take harm reduction approaches in not just substance use, but in protecting our kids. If we have a parent who is stressed and overwhelmed and doesn't know what to do with, say, they have a child who may have a behavioral disorder, a harm reduction approach to that is, let's figure out a way to get that parent some respite care, right? We are reducing the potential harm that could come to that family, that could come to that situation. It's also known in some fields in this arena as safety planning, right? Harm reduction, safety planning, it all goes hand in hand. So, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, this is a topic that can get a lot of, it can make a lot of people uncomfortable. As a matter of fact, the first time I presented this topic, I quickly saw that discomfort in the audience that I was presenting to. One thing, so I decided to from then on make this acknowledgement slide. As we talk about these things, you're going to hopefully hear me talk about this topic of parents who use drugs and children impacted by addiction in a way that is different than what you have heard previously, right? So I just have to give these acknowledgments at the beginning, because even though I'm going to talk about these things in a way that is compassionate, that is trauma informed, and that is trying to maybe shift our perspectives just a little bit, I also have to acknowledge things like family substance use can absolutely create unsafe environments for children in the home, right? We know that. I can be as positive as possible about this, but it does not negate that fact. Secondly, I acknowledge that family substance misuse is an adverse childhood experience, right? It is. It's oftentimes an adverse childhood experience for the parents that we work with. It's also an adverse childhood experience for the children that we are trying to keep safe and support. And we know that those long-term ACEs can lead to negative health outcomes. Next, I also have to acknowledge that substance use is a very complicated disease, right? It is. It is a disease, it is complicated, and it is a challenge. It has to be addressed with compassion, empathy, and understanding. And that can be very difficult whenever you have children in the mix. It can be very, very difficult to wrap your brain around them. And then last, I have to acknowledge that the stigma that is experienced by parents who use substances is often a barrier to seeking out help and support. Now, this last bullet, I have to say, this is not just my opinion, okay? This is based in research. This is based in actual, and we will cite some of that later in this presentation, but actual research around parents who fit this population, and they talk about what are the reasons why you didn't get help before, say, DCFS had to get involved. This is also based in the lived experiences of the wonderful team that I get to work with. Thankfully, they trust me enough that they share their stories with me, and I'm so blessed to have that. But this is one theme that I see all the time. And if you think about it, you think about the families that you work with, whether you work in a health department in, say, a WIC program, or whether you work for DCFS, whatever. Overall, no parent wants to admit that they have a drug problem, right? No parent wants to admit that. They're terrified. Even more so whenever they are pregnant or they have children at home that they're potentially at risk of losing due to that substance use problem. So moving forward, I just want everyone to keep these things in mind as they help to guide our conversation here. We're going to do a quick gut check, okay? So in the chat, I have 4 groups of people here. My group 1 is unhoused people who use drugs. My group 2 is parents who use drugs. My group 3 are employed people who use drugs, and my group 4 are unemployed people who use drugs. Now, you may say, Megan, those are the most random groups. And you're right, they are. But I promise there is a point to this. What I'm going to ask you to do is I want you to read those groups, okay? Let it sit and kind of percolate for a minute. And then I want you to tell me in the chat, I want you to give me a ranking here of how those groups fall 1 to 4. 1 is that you are unbothered by that group, mostly unbothered, right? Or you're not mostly, because that's 2. You are unbothered. It is, you don't have an opinion, you don't have a strong reaction, something like that. 2, you're mostly unbothered. Maybe it sits a little bit uneasy, but you're kind of like, it is what it is, right? 3, we're bothered. It's something that is going to, we're not comfortable with. It immediately gives kind of that gut clench reaction. And then 4 is you are very bothered. These are the things that keep you up at night. These are the things that constantly worry you, that are on your radar, that you're constantly looking out for. These are the things that really bother you. So if you don't care, in the chat, give me your rankings. And we will just look through those here. Okay, so I see a comment. When you say drugs, do you mean alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs? Yes, I do. I mean drugs, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, methamphetamine, opioids, any and all drugs that you can possibly think of. That is what I'm talking about. That's a great question. So I see 1. We have a 1 for the parents who use drugs. Okay. Group 1 is a 3, very bothered, bothered, unhoused people who use drugs. Okay. 1, 4, 3, 2. Okay. I'm heartfelt for all of them. I just want to help them. I completely understand, Deborah. Totally understand that feeling. All right. So we have group 4, unemployed folks who use drugs, ranked at a bothered. Group 3 ranked at a bothered. Group 2 ranked at a very bothered, and group 1 ranked at a 2. Okay. We have, so it seems like the theme here across the board that I'm picking up is group 2 almost universally is ranked at a number 4, right? Very bothered. We're very bothered by this. And that makes sense, right? Whenever we think about these other groups of people, whenever we think about unhoused folks who are using drugs, oftentimes, you know, especially if you're in this field, you know that substance use is something that is very common to coincide with homelessness, right? Substance use and mental health challenges. When we think about our employed people who use drugs, oftentimes I think that people, or from what I've seen at least, people are a little bit less bothered by that group because there's something about that employed piece, right? Like they are they're functional, or maybe they're contributing to society, whatever you want to call it. But that one typically is a little bit less bothered. Unemployed people, same but reverse situation. And then obviously, no surprise why parents who use drugs would be at the top as being very, very bothersome, very worrisome to all of us. But let me ask you some questions. When you were making these rankings, what assumptions did you make about these groups? Because if we're honest, every single day with the people that we work with, the people that we support, our coworkers, our clients, whatever, we make assumptions, right? We're human. Humans make assumptions. We try not to, and that's a great thing. Definitely try not to, but we all do. We make assumptions, and assumptions shape how we approach situations. So what were some of the assumptions that were made about each of these groups? Yep. When it comes to kids, safety is a worry. Absolutely. Okay. They don't care about themselves or others, especially their dependents. Yep. Okay. Sad to think about kids suffering in this situation. Yes, absolutely. So it sounds like we made a lot of assumptions, right, about our parents, right? And that's again totally human of you, totally typical of you, right? Of us as a group, as people, right? Behaviors to be copied. Yeah, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That is definitely a concern. My second discussion question here is, when you were making these rankings, what are some of the thought processes or maybe beliefs about these particular groups that really kind of influenced how you ranked them? Thank you, Tyrone. I see that comment and I appreciate that. I really do. Yep. Thank you, Kat. Thank you for chiming in there. What are some of those thought processes or beliefs that you think kind of quickly went into play in how you structured your rankings? And I just want everyone to know this is a safe space, right? Um, that I know that sounds crazy whenever we've got, it's you and 70 of your closest friends from in here, but this is a safe space. And if we don't talk about these things and talk about our assumptions and our beliefs, it is, and talk about them in an open and honest way, how are we ever supposed to learn and grow, right? If you're comfortable, you're probably not growing. So I'm seeing some comments come in now from that discussion question too. Kids have no choice. What drove these people to turn to drugs? Absolutely. Try not to assume. I would like everyone to live a happy and healthy life. Yes, Michelle, I agree. That is 100% absolutely. I hope that's a driving force in most of us. Group one, the unhoused population, lots of mental health and addiction issues, and they don't necessarily want help. Yep, that can sometimes be the case. Based on lived experience in group two and knowing how it can affect another child with similar situations with multiple dynamics involved, including DCFS. Yes. We just want people, we want to help people so they can return their children home. Yep. Putting kids at risk. Absolutely. So we're seeing a theme here, right? We're concerned about obviously our kiddos' safeties. We are concerned about our kids picking up on these behaviors that they may be witnessing their parents do. We're concerned about the environment that these kids may be living in. And we are concerned about how all of those things can potentially impact the long-term development of those children. And G3, thank you, Juliana, for saying that. If they have a job, then maybe they're doing okay. That is one of the most common assumptions and beliefs around, again, employed people who use drugs, right? We assume if they're holding down a job, if they're showing up to work, if they're functional, that maybe they're okay, right? But how often have we seen that when you dive past that surface layer of that exterior appearance of I've got my stuff together, right? When we get into that, we find out, oh wow, this person is really struggling, or this person is, they can only get out of bed in the morning if they use first thing. That's common, right? We see that all the time. We see that constantly. My last question, and this is a tough one, okay, but I'm going to ask for your most vulnerable honesty here. And again, this is a safe space. Is there, out of these four groups, is there one group in this list that you would absolutely dread working with? And don't say, I don't ever dread working with anyone, because again, we are all human, right? And it's okay. We provide services. We do it hopefully in an unbiased way, but we all have our preferences on what groups of people we prefer to work with and what groups we prefer to not work with. Long time unhoused, group one. Yep. I'm seeing a lot of group ones. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Okay. Sorry. If I go down the rabbit hole that my brain wants to go down right now, we won't even get through this webinar because I'm so curious about the group one responses and just what the thoughts are behind that. Okay. Thank you guys so much for going through this exercise with me. The whole reason that I wanted to do this is because, as I said in our acknowledgments, parents who use drugs and families impacted by substance use are some of the most stigmatized people that we could potentially work with, right? And these gut checks are not meant to make you feel bad. They're not meant to make you, they're meant to make you think, right? They're meant to make you really think about what is my gut reaction to this situation, because in this line of work, in this field, you have to always be aware of how your gut knee-jerk reaction may impact the way you deliver your services and the way you are able to support your clients, whether that would be effectively or ineffectively. I'm sure this is old hat for a lot of people, but just in case, it's always good for a refresher. Let's define stigma, right? I've said that word probably 5 times this morning, and I'm going to say it several more. But stigma, I want to make sure that we all have a really clear understanding of what that means. Stigma refers to any negative attitude, prejudice, or false belief associated with specific traits, circumstances, or health symptoms. It is similar and related, but it is different than discrimination because discrimination refers to how someone treats a person based on the stigmatized ideas that they hold. If we are going to talk about parents who use drugs and children impacted by addiction, we have to come into this with a stigma gate that is open and acknowledge that we do have these assumptions, right? Some of us do. Some of us hold these beliefs about this particular group of people that we may work with. We have to acknowledge them. We don't want to stuff them down and pretend like they're not there because then they just grow stronger, right? If we acknowledge them and we own that that's how we're feeling, then that's when we can actually work through it. We can actually think through it and maybe, just maybe, be open to something that might shift your perspective just a little bit. One thing I want to say after over a decade in this field is if you ever think that you have checked all of your biases, that you have unlearned all of your stigmatized beliefs, you're dead wrong. Hear me when I say that. You are dead wrong. This is an ongoing thing that we have to be very conscious of. We have to be very aware of. If you ever think that you've done all the work you need to do to avoid stigma and bias in the way you work with people, you need to take a really deep look because chances are there's still more work to be done. Even after being in this field for as long as I've been in it, I still and working with people who, are people with lived experience who are literally the backbone of this organization that I lead. They are the backbone of this. Even after that, I still can sometimes have those knee-jerk reaction thoughts, assumptions, things like that, that impact the way we're able to function as a team and the way we're able to serve our clients. We have to check those things in ourselves, and that is a battle that is never done. So let's dive a little deeper on this. Looking at this term, drug endangered children, we've heard this term a lot. It is the we have debt councils. Debt councils do absolutely incredible work. They do so much good for the communities. They are especially huge assets in our rural communities, right? They do such fantastic work. But again, let's challenge some of these thoughts and assumptions, okay? When you hear the phrase a drug endangered child, what are some of the things that come to your mind? What are some of the images that pop into your head? Drug endangered child, trauma, scared children, mhm, children who are exposed and have access to substances, neglect, overdosing, yep, unfed, neglect, neglect, neglect and danger, absolutely, absolutely. Developmental delays, children living in a trap house, trauma, emotional neglect. Yes. So it sounds like there's several factors that these children would be endangered by, right? It could be the actions of the parents or caregivers. It could be the context of the environment. Does the family have a support system? Does that child have a support system outside of their parents that they can utilize, if they need it? Is the home environment? I saw, children living in a trap house. Absolutely. Children being exposed to substances, children potentially being around drugs that, they could crawl. I've heard this several times, infants, or little ones, under a year old crawling on the floor, and there's substances in the home, and the infants get, accidental exposure because of that, because they're being babies, right? They're crawling around. They're doing exactly what we want them to do. They're doing what's developmentally appropriate. And yet the environment has posed a danger to them. And then we also talk about, the neglect piece, right? And not just the neglect, but also the long-term impact for children, that long-term impact of potentially feeling, lonely, or feeling like they have to fight for their parents' attention, feeling like they have to, feeling like they, when they get older, that they're destined, this is their path that they're destined to walk. All of those things, yes, everything that is in the chat, I would say is absolutely true, right? This does define drug endangered children. But what if I told you that those ideas, that those definitions that we just shared might actually be a little bit influenced by stigma and how we approach these things? Yes, neglect is absolutely a risk factor whenever you have a child who is in a home where substance use is an issue. Yes, there is absolutely potential for exposure. Yes, all of the things that we talked about in the chat are absolute possibilities, and we see them, right? Especially if you work in child welfare, you see this stuff. It happens. But what if I told you that we have many more parents who use drugs in hiding in the bathroom, and then they go out and they cook their children dinner, they feed their children, they put them to bed, they read them a bedtime story? What if I told you that we have parents who use drugs that nobody in their life knows about it? Nobody knows. They're functional. They may be involved in the PTO, PTA. I always get those mixed up. They may be involved in that. They may be, the community champion for, you know, kids, like creating opportunities for kids to do things. What if I told you that was the circumstance? More often than not, this is the case. And here is how I know that. Okay. Substance use, and we will get into this here in just a moment. Substance use is incredibly common in the United States. Okay. It's incredibly common in the state of Illinois. When we look at the prevalence rates of substance use disorders in parents or children living in homes where addiction is a factor, and we compare that with homes where there's DCFS involvement, there are, chronic school complaints, there are chronic issues with the child, things like that, there are definitely families, a significant portion of them, that are flying under that radar, right? That are functional. They're function. We talked about that with the gut check. They're functional just enough that they're making sure their children's needs are met. They love their children. They want to be there for them. They're taking care of them. They're meeting parenting standards. But at the same time, they're also battling a substance use disorder. Now, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion based on my experience, okay? A lot of the challenges that we talked about here, and I see what you just said, Deborah, and you're spot on. A lot of the challenges that we talked about in here are things that happen when that substance use goes unchecked, when that parent is too afraid to reach out for help, and they begin to spiral deeper and deeper and deeper into their substance use, into their addiction, right? Eventually, they won't be able to hold it together anymore. That's what happens, right? So the thing that we have to do, and this is kind of, I don't know, this is how I think about this. We have to be early interrupters, right? We have to be early interrupters. We have to identify these families before we get to the circumstances where we have children who are being neglected. We have to identify these families before we get to the circumstances where we have a child that is being taken to the emergency room because of substance exposure. We have to reach these families before that. But here's the catch. These families, oftentimes we don't know about them because they are too scared to ask for help. And what does that all circle back around to? Somebody say it in the chat. It all circles back around to stigma. Exactly. There is this overwhelming belief that if a parent with a substance use disorder reaches out for help, they believe they are automatically going to lose their children. They do. Whenever after I had my first child, or my second child, I apologize. I have three, so they kind of run together after a while. After I had my second child, I had terrible postpartum depression. I had never experienced it before. And I got to about a week postpartum, and I was on my knees in my baby's room, crying, having an absolute come apart, honestly wishing, and trigger warning, wishing that I would just die because I couldn't handle this. My kids were going to be better off without me. That was what I fully believed. And then at that time, my husband came home. He saw that I needed help, and he called my doctor. We talked to the doctor, and I remember, and I had worked in this field forever. I mean, I knew the system, right? I knew what we take kids for, or what we have to take protective custody for, all of these things. And yet, in that moment, when I am operating in my downstairs brain, and I am scared, and I am terrified, and I am absolutely overwhelmed, and I can't see the way out of the forest, all I could say is, please don't take my baby. Please don't take my baby. I was having a mental health crisis, right? And that is what I was focused on. I wasn't focused on getting myself help. All I could think about is, I can't go ask for help because someone is going to think that I'm unfit and not safe for this child to stay with. Now, logically, looking back, I know that's not the case, right? We know that. And yet, in the moment, whenever again, I'm panicked and I'm scrambling and I'm scared. That's all I could think about. And I know how the system works. So think about these parents who don't know how the system works. They don't understand, the things that DCFS doesn't like to take protective custody, right? That's not something that they enjoy doing, and that's not something that they prefer to do, right? There's so much stigma around this. And so instead, parents, they suffer in silence. And then they spiral, they get deeper and deeper. And unfortunately, that's often when they come to our attention. Child maltreatment and neglect does not happen in a vacuum. It does not happen in a way that nobody else in that child's life knows about it, typically. Okay. Now, I understand there are certain circumstances where this may not necessarily apply. But in this situation, when we're talking about drug endangered children, there it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So we have our deck iceberg here. Okay. So on the surface, I love a good iceberg analogy. On the surface, we have this label, this group of drug endangered children, right? We know what the risks are. We know what our ideas are about them, about that group, what some of the risk factors, what may be, all of those things. But when we dive a little bit deeper under the surface, what we often find can really add a lot of good insight into helping us understand not just the experience of the child, but also what is the experience of the parent in this situation. So sometimes we find that maybe we have a child whose temperament is challenging. And please don't take that as I'm blaming the child, right? Because that is certainly not true. But we also have to be honest. And I mean, I'm a parent of a child with autism, and it can be a real challenge, right? Thankfully, I have a very supportive partner, and we navigate that. But I can't imagine doing those things on my own. I can't imagine the stress that I would feel and the pressure that I would feel, right? Sometimes we have child trauma, you know. Children oftentimes are, or sometimes are, victim to trauma, whether it's abuse or whatever, and it's not necessarily at the hands of their parents, right? It's at the hands of something else. It could be abuse, it could be a loss of someone. We know that trauma runs the gamut, but child trauma can also create a lot of really challenging circumstances for a family. It really can. We have our children's behavioral mental health challenges. We have medically complex children. There are not enough respite programs, especially in our southern region here. There's not enough, right? And so we have parents who literally cannot work. They cannot do anything because they don't have any backup to help care for their children. We also, parent mental health, huge component of this, right? We know that so often substance use in all populations is driven by trying to fix something within ourselves, trying to self-medicate, trying to make something better, right? And mental health is one of those drivers. Also, we have parent capacity. If a parent was raised in an environment where they weren't necessarily shown how to appropriately discipline, how to appropriately play with their children, how to do all the things that we, magically expect parents to know how to do once they have children, it takes a toll. It takes a toll on the parent's mental health. It takes a toll on the parent's confidence in their ability to parent that child, right? Parent addiction is another one. Interpersonal violence, domestic violence, that's a big one. Oftentimes, so we find those things. Whenever we dig into it, we start asking some questions, we do our intake, we get to know the family a little bit better. But if we don't keep digging, then we end up missing a really crucial piece of the puzzle here. And that is what is going on with the parent support system, and the environment in which this parent is trying to raise a child that could be adding to the pressure and the stress that is being experienced in this situation. So we miss parent trauma. We miss poor community environments, environments where, again, there's no respite options, there's no childcare options, there's no breaks. I live in a community in Gallatin County. Like I said, we don't have one single CCR&R approved childcare provider in this entire county. Now tell me how parents are supposed to work, go to school, provide for their families if we don't have that option. And yet it's been like that for a very long time. We also have parental fear. We have generational family substance use. This is another one. We talk about it a lot, but what we fail to talk about so often is the fact that generational family substance use oftentimes morphs into family culture. It becomes the culture of that family. It becomes the culture of that family's network, right? I've learned this so much through working with some of the people with lived experience that I have, that, you know, they grew up in homes where substance use was a factor. And it was kind of just expected that when they hit a certain age, that this would be part of their life, right? Now, to us, that seems outlandish, unbelievable. It seems we can't wrap our heads around why a parent would want that for their child, right? But it happens, and generations go by and we keep the cycle going. We also have food insecurity, limited employment options, lack of a support network, all of these things that really fall into that social determinants of health category that really we miss so often. We miss, and it's so important. If you take nothing away from this presentation today, I hope that you take this away, that whenever you are working with a family, you have a family in front of you, don't just ask about the parent's mental health. Don't just ask about the child's mental health. Dive in deeper and see, is that parent worried about how they're going to put food on the table? Is that parent worried about how they're going to get and keep a job because they don't have childcare? Has that parent been through any trauma? It may take a little bit longer, but I promise it's going to be worth your time, because it's going to give you a piece of the puzzle that you would not get if you do not ask. Okay. When we look at the scope, I'm just going to stay on this slide briefly here, but when we look at the scope of the challenge, about 1 in 8 children in the United States live with at least one parent with a substance use disorder. 1 in 8. So if you take a class of, say, 20 kids, right? At least statistically speaking, at least 2 of those kids is going to fall into this category of being a child impacted by addiction. Now, we know that in rural communities, those numbers are oftentimes much higher, right? Because we know that substance use is something that drastically impacts rural communities. And again, it stays hidden until something happens and we blow the cover off of it. We also know that about 9 out of 10 people in the general population, so this would include parents, this would include people who are unhoused, all of those groups from that exercise in the beginning, about 9 out of 10 people struggling with a substance use disorder never receive treatment. That is a hard pill to swallow. That is a hard fact to sit with, right? That is a very hard fact to sit with. Whenever we think about these families that are suffering, these parents that are suffering and trying to navigate these things on their own, and we have programs, right? We have things that we can do. We have some support services, things like that. And yet they never get help. They never get help. Oftentimes, the number one barrier that they cite is stigma. Fear of how they're going to be treated, fear of how they're going to be viewed, fear of what may happen if they say uncle, basically. They cry uncle. This is the hard stuff. It absolutely is. None of us are comfortable with the idea of kids growing up in home where addiction is a factor. But it doesn't change the fact that it happens in our communities every single day. The kids that your kids are friends with at school, chances are at least one of them, they're probably a child impacted by addiction, right? Your child's classmates, same situation. The kids that you see walking to school every day, same situation. It happens. It's real. It's in our communities, and turning a blind eye to it does not help anyone. And yet, we still have to help, right? This is happening. We're not comfortable with it, but we still have to help. So, how do we humanize parents who use drugs? Well, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, right? And it really kind of depends on what works for you. Some people who have the lived experience of being a person who used drugs or being a person in recovery, it's oftentimes easier for them to humanize this population, to realize that they're human, right? And that is at the core of it. They are human. Yes, they are parents. Yes, they are parents who are potentially doing things that are absolutely not acceptable when it comes to neglect and, exposing their children to different, circumstances and activities. But at the core of it, they are human, right? When we humanize parents, that is first and foremost a trauma-informed approach. It absolutely is. We have to realize that, again, we are all the sum of our experiences. The parents that you work with, the parents that are sitting in front of you, are the sum of the experiences that they have had. That is what has led them to this point. That is what has shaped who they are. So, understanding that and holding that in mind is trauma informed. Also, I find that one of the, I don't want to say easiest, but one of the best things that I can do to help me humanize parents is to, one, be fueled by curiosity, right? And I'm not talking about curiosity like nosy curiosity. I'm talking about curiosity like wonder. I'm wondering what happened to you. I'm wondering what how did the situation get like this? I'm wondering what it looked like before the situation got like this. I'm wondering what your goal is. What do you want for your family, right? Curiosity is always your friend. And it's honestly one of the most underutilized tools in all of our tool belts, but most effective. It really is. I apologize if you saw that pop up that just came up on my screen there. Um, Next, we have to assume positive intent. Now, this one, this one always gets folks who are working in the field on the front lines every day in child welfare. And I get it. I worked in child welfare. I get it. We have to assume positive intent with the parents. We have to give them that courtesy that until we know more, until we've asked our questions, gotten to know them, we have to assume positive intent. If we go into situations, especially working with parents who use drugs, where we are automatically assuming that that parent is selfish, that they don't care about their children, that they don't want their children, that they don't love their children, we are doing that family a disservice. And that disservice doesn't just impact the parent, right? It also impacts the child, because we know research has shown multiple times, time and time again, that children thrive and do best when they can be raised in their home of origin. Now, I know that is not always possible. I'm not living in a dream world, I promise. I know that's not always possible. But when we're going into these situations, we have to at least go into it with positive intent. Assume that those parents love their kids, right? Assume that they want to keep their kids. Assume that they want what is in their children's best interest. Now, again, I know, unfortunately, this is not always the case. But I promise, if you approach the families that you work with in this manner, more oftentimes than not, you're going to find that this is the case. Now, parents loving their children, parents wanting what's best for their children, assuming that parents want to keep their children, does any of that mitigate the fact that, you know, sometimes parents are creating situations that are potentially dangerous for children? No, it absolutely doesn't. And that's something we have to address, right? But when we assume positive intent, when we assume that the parent in front of us isn't, choosing to love drugs more than they love their children, when we realize that addiction is a brain disease, is oftentimes, especially whenever a person is deep in the addiction, it's not even a choice really for them anymore. They're using to maintain, basically. They're using so they don't go into withdrawal, right? It's not even when people get to that point, using drugs isn't, and this is what I've heard, using drugs isn't even enjoyable when that happens, right? They have to do it to maintain. When a person gets to that point, if we approach them with positive intent, if we approach them with the assumption that they would like to get better and that they would like to ultimately raise their children and be in their children's lives, you're going to get a lot farther with that family than you would if you approach them with that idea in your head or that assumption that they are consciously making this choice of drugs over their children. So going back to our deck iceberg here, we know that family addiction can absolutely impact children. To fully understand this issue, we got to go deeper, right? We have to look again at the things that we often miss. Those things create the foundation of what a family needs to thrive in a community. They really do. And some of these things you may think, eh, we'll get into them. We have to look at the foundation of what a family needs. Before we can look at the foundation, though, I want to challenge us. Let's look at what the bricks in the foundation are made of. Okay. I like to obviously I love analogies, right? I love to think of this idea of we're a family, we're building a house, right? We're building a home, we're putting it on a sturdy foundation, we're putting our children on a sturdy foundation. What does that foundation consist of? That foundation consists of that parent, right? That parent's experiences, how that parent is able to respond to that child, how that parent parents that child, what kind of support systems are in place, all of these different things. And we have to talk about, if we're going to look at what creates the foundation, right, and those foundational needs, we would be really missing the point if we didn't just briefly touch on adverse childhood experiences and how those things connect with substance use disorders. If you've been in this field for any amount of time, you know that so often the person in front of you, whether that is a parent, a grandparent, a caregiver, whomever, adversity didn't start with them, right? They're not the first people in their family to experience this. Oftentimes, they are the product of generations of adversity, generations of trauma, of poverty, of lack of resources. And unfortunately, these cycles will continue to cycle until someone steps out of that loop. There's two great studies here, and I just highlighted some information on this because when we're, in my opinion, one of the easiest ways to humanize parents who use drugs is to view them as the children that they once were, right? Now, again, don't mistake that for me saying that we're not going to hold them accountable and all of those things, because they're certainly adults now, right? But whenever we approach a parent with the question of what happened to you, tell me about your childhood. Tell me about what was it like in your home growing up? What was it like in what was your relationship like with your parents? Did you feel like as a kid that you had someone you could go to talk if you needed to? Did you feel like you had a safe space if you needed to use it? When we dig a little deeper into these things, we can really start to make that mindset shift of viewing that parent not just as a person, but as a child who was hurt once upon a time, hurt emotionally, hurt psychologically, hurt physically, but hurt in some way, right? Now, luckily, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study has done a ton of beautiful research for us, has spawned just so much important and groundbreaking knowledge related to how people who use drugs are impacted by adverse childhood experiences. It's probably not new information that if someone has experienced 4 or more ACEs, they are at a much, I believe it's 12 times more likely to have a substance use disorder. But here's 2 studies that I thought were especially interesting because they also apply to the general population. So we talk about the correlation between ACEs that parents experience and how those things later in life could create a substance use disorder or could, create circumstances where a parent might develop a substance use disorder, right? But this study also kind of talks about the flip side of that, where we look at the group of people, we look at the general population of people with a substance use disorder, and we see that that population itself has a higher prevalence of ACEs. I see your comment there, Deborah. Over 90% of the clients we access have childhood or some type of abuse. Yes. So in my experience working in community-based mental health, about it, I believe, and this was several years ago, but the statistic was about 90% then of people that came into our organization for mental health services or substance use services. About 90% of them had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. And statistically speaking, I believe about 60% have experienced 4 or more. Now, 4 or more is important because in the ACEs, it seems like 4 or more is really kind of the tipping point of when things start to pile on, right? We pile on that allostatic stress. We pile on all of those things internally within that person. And those are things that they carry with them throughout their life as they grow, as they parent, as they go through life. They continue to carry those things with them until they are given the opportunity to hopefully heal from them. Our second study here said that compared to those with no ACEs, individuals with at least 4 ACEs were 4 times more likely to have problems with alcohol or drug use. 4 times more likely. So my 12 was wrong. 12 was actually, that is the statistic related to suicide attempt and adverse childhood experiences. 4 times more likely if you have 4 or more ACEs. Now, if we know that about 60% of the general population has 4 or more ACEs, that percentage of people are 4 times more likely, 400% more likely to have problems with drugs or alcohol. We can't ignore that, right? We can't ignore that. We also have to look at influential factors in how our ACEs work across the lifespan and how these things may differ between genders. Now, why is that important? That's important because when we're talking about parents who use drugs, there is a very specific subgroups that go with that you would be surprised are not equally stigmatized, right? So we have fathers who use drugs and we have mothers who use drugs. I actually did a poll about this at a conference that I was at last year where I polled all of the attendees of the conference. There was about 500 people there. And I said, which one bothers you more? A father who's using drugs or a mother who's using drugs? And almost unanimously, the answer was a mother who uses drugs. Mothers who use drugs, especially pregnant mothers who use drugs, are some of the most stigmatized people. And you may say, yeah, of course they are. Right? Like that makes sense. They're potentially putting their fetus at risk. Mothers in our society are traditionally seen as the primary caregivers, right? So of course they would be more stigmatized. But we have to break it down a little bit farther because we know that stigma is a barrier, right? Stigma is a barrier. If we don't look at the fact that our parents and especially our mothers are most at risk of suffering in silence with substance use issues, with addiction, if we're not conscious of that, we're missing some very important pieces here. So there's obviously a lot of influential factors in this ACE and substance use disorder correlation. Females with a history of ACEs had a 5.9-fold higher likelihood of developing an alcohol use disorder. Ironically, on the flip side, males with a history of ACEs had a 5-fold higher likelihood of developing an illicit drug use disorder. So it's interesting to see how the varying types of ACEs impact fathers versus mothers, and not only that, but impact the choice of drug, right? Impact the choice of drug and what is ultimately used. When we talk about accumulation of ACEs, this is again that allostatic load of ACEs piling on top of ACEs, right? Eventually, they just stack up. And again, those things it's been proven, damaging to our brain. They're damaging. The best predictor was an accumulation of individual ACE types, where the risk of developing an illicit drug use disorder increased 1.4-fold, so about 140% for every individual ACE type experienced. So when you think divorce, there's one ACE. Mom has a substance use disorder, there's 2 ACEs. Dad's in jail, 3 ACEs. I was emotionally abused by someone who is in a caregiver capacity, 4 ACEs. And they just keep piling. And as they keep piling, my risk gets higher and higher and higher and higher. Last thing I'm going to say on this, our type of ACEs also play a role in this. Interestingly, we found that emotional neglect out of all of the different types of ACEs was most often associated with substance use disorders. Emotional neglect. That was surprising to me. But that shows the importance of connection and relationships. And in my opinion, drives home and really underscores why we have to support these parents in a different way, right? We have to teach them how to connect with their children. We have to teach them what responsive parenting looks like. We have to do this. Unfortunately, in this field, we often see parents at their worst. I say that a lot. Typically, whenever someone is referred to me or referred to our organization, it's not because they're loving life and doing great. It's because they need help and they're struggling. And unfortunately, not every parent we work with is going to be ready to make the changes necessary to make a healthier life for their family. It's a hard pill to swallow. It can take an emotional toll on us when we want it more than they do, right? But it's something that we have to accept, and we can't let it douse our fire, because there are parents out there that want to change. There are parents out there that want to take care of their babies and that are ready to make those changes. So how do we do it? Well, We're starting with our very first foundation here. First thing, we have to have a support system. Those parents have to have a support system. This goes beyond just having someone you can call when you need to vent. This goes beyond having a best friend that you feel comfortable talking with and disclosing things. This gets into looking at that parent's environment as a whole, the environment of their community, the environment of their resources, right? We know that social determinants of health impact all parents and families. It impacts parents or people parenting in rural communities or impoverished communities, especially at a higher rate. This creates situations where we have lack of family preservation and family support. You have parents raising children in isolation. That is a breeding ground for potential child abuse and neglect. You have workforce and funding issues that impact the resources that are available in the community. You have economic disadvantage, right? If a parent needs a job, like I keep coming back to Gallatin County, but it's true. In Gallatin County, we have less than 5,000 people. We have 86 employers. The closest town to us is about 20 minutes away, 25 maybe. And so if transportation is an issue, if I don't have reliable transportation, if I don't have childcare, I have to have a job. How am I going to do that? Right? We're just stacking on and on and on. We just continue to stack and pile, and these things all accumulate. We also have lack of opportunity, lack of evidence-based understanding, and an abundance of stigma. And this is across all service fields. It really, really is. I have seen some of the most competent, well-trained providers hold some of the most upsetting, stigmatizing beliefs. And it's just something that we have to address by talking about it. Honestly, that's the only way to address it. If we don't talk about it, if we don't call it out, it's never going to change. We also have to address that parent trauma. We really do. And this can be a really challenging one, right? It really can be, because so often parents may not see the connection, right? One of my favorite things that I love to do is there's a podcast that I love, and it's called Soft White Underbelly. If you haven't listened to it, and you're a story lover, I highly encourage you to listen to it, because it's literally just an interviewer who is talking to a variety of people from all different walks of life about their life experiences, about their child experiences. And one of my favorite episodes is the interview is talking to a wealth coach. And this wealth coach is probably in his 80s at this point. And he's talking about how, this generation doesn't get enough tough love. And he's talking about how, saying a lot of things like people are lazy, all of these, really, really negative things, maybe a little bit true, but really negative things. And then the interviewer shifts into, and it's so subtle, it's just beautiful. The interviewer shifts into discussing this 80-year-old man's childhood. And this 80-year-old man talks about how he was raised, what his family looked like. And you start to see the onion unpeel, right? You start to see the layers come back. You start to see where he gets this ruthless approach, where he gets this tough love approach. It came from his father. It came from his parents, right? But he's not even aware. That's the craziest thing of it all. He's not even aware that there's a connection. He doesn't see the connection. We have to educate parents on that connection. The only way we can educate parents on that connection is by asking them, what happened to you? Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about what you've experienced that still bothers you, even if it happened 20 years ago. That's the only way that we can start to get them to think about how their experiences as children or as adolescents may be impacting the things that they do every single day now. We also have to realize that trauma, especially childhood trauma, it stays relevant and it stays active across the entire lifespan until it's dealt with, right? It is difficult. And we all know this, you will face varying degrees of resistance with families whenever it comes to things like talking about mental health. And again, a lot of that comes back to stigma. But when we start to plant the seeds of maybe you feel this way because this is something that happened to you, or this is how you were always treated. When we start to plant those seeds, we can just create some thoughts, right? Some thoughts in that person's head that maybe gets them a little bit curious and gets them starting to think. We have to get them to address their own trauma. We have to help them, we have to help provide them the resources and the equipment to take that journey. And that is a hard journey, but it's what has to happen most often if they want to get better, if they want to change their circumstances. Our last foundational need here, this is a no-brainer, right? Understanding and acceptance. Now, you may think, I could never accept a parent who uses drugs. I could never understand a parent who uses drugs. And that's okay. You're human. You're allowed to feel those things. You're allowed to think those things. But what you are not allowed to do, what we have to safeguard against, is that those thoughts, those beliefs do not flow over into the work that we do. If that happens, not only are you not giving that family, that parent, a fair chance, but you're also robbing them of the opportunity to take control of their life and change their circumstances. They have been faced, chances are, with plenty of stigma from all kinds of people, whether it's healthcare providers, employers, community members, whatever. They've been faced with tons of stigma, right? I apologize. There is a baby here right now at my office, and they are having a great time in the lobby. When we do not when we are not able to approach families with this neutral curiosity, right? We're robbing them of the chance to make the changes that they need to make in their lives. That's not fair. We at least have to give parents the opportunity. I like to tell my team here that, every single day we work with people that are at varying places in their life. We work with people who are still very much in the thick of active addiction. We work with people who are fresh in recovery. We work with people who've been in recovery for a long time, but they're at risk of relapse due to some circumstance or something that has happened. But the thing that I always tell my team is that if this person isn't able to make the changes that they need to make, it's not going to be because of us, right? It's not going to be because of anything that we didn't do or that we robbed them of an opportunity. We have to come to everyone with a clean slate. We have to. That's hard. And I'm going to tell you, it takes a lot of mental gymnastics to do it. But challenge yourself, be curious, and eventually, I promise you, it gets easier. I have 2 more slides left, and then I will wrap up. I'll never forget, about 2 years ago, I was at I think it was the Prevent Child Abuse Illinois conference, I believe. And Jerry Moe was speaking there. If you don't know who Jerry Moe is, he is incredible, first of all. He has been extremely instrumental in creating the Carly character on Sesame Street. That's the character whose mother struggles with addiction. They've also struggled with homelessness and all of these other factors that are very real, that a lot of our kids in our community struggle with every single day, right? And I was going to be presenting at this conference. As a matter of fact, his presentation was at about 10 o'clock in the morning. My presentation was at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay. And I went to his presentation and he said this quote right here on this screen. And I literally left his presentation after it was over, went back to my hotel room and redid my entire slide deck for my 1 o'clock presentation because it hit me so hard. Help the children. Obviously, we always want to help the children. We want to keep them safe. We want them to grow up happy, healthy, and in a protected and safe environment. Help the children. But if you really want to impact the next generation, help the people who are raising them. That quote sticks with me. It will always stick with me. This is the part that we miss so often. We get so focused on protecting our kids, and that's understandable, right? That's totally understandable. Of course, we want to protect our babies. Of course, we want to protect our kids. But when we are only laser focused on protecting the family or the children, we're neglecting the family as a unit. We're neglecting to give the parents the opportunity to raise their children. We're potentially robbing the children of the opportunity to grow up in their home with their parents. Now, sometimes this is obviously out of our control, right? A lot of times it is, and that's unfortunate. But what I'm trying to get at here today is that if we can approach these situations with unbiased curiosity, oftentimes we get a better response from these parents. One of my favorite things, we have this wonderful program here at CIRAC. It's called the BRIC program, and it stands for Building Resilience in Caregivers and Kids. And it's a program that is really, it's a child abuse prevention program. It is an upstream approach to child abuse prevention. And what we do is we try to provide support for families that are at risk of becoming involved with DCFS because of adverse circumstances in their lives. And I will never forget one of the things that, and I think about this so often, all of our direct service staff on that program are people with lived experience. Okay. So these are people that have been involved with DCFS before. These are people that have been through addiction. These are people that have lost children to DCFS. Okay. And now they're getting to use their story. They're getting to use their experiences to help these families who are in really tenuous circumstances. And I'll never forget, whenever we first started this program, one of my favorite things, one of my peer support workers went to meet a new client. And she went to this client's house. They were talking through their intake. This client was very guarded at first. She's been through the system herself. She has a lot of negative experiences with service providers. And she looked at my wonderful peer support worker and she said, "You're not like everyone else." And my peer said, "You're right, I'm not, because I've been exactly where you are." That mama is now thriving in a home, safe. When we got her, we literally picked her up as she was literally fleeing on the street from a domestic violence situation. We have to give people a chance. We have to give people a chance. We have to go in with positive intent. We have to assume parents want to raise their kids and that maybe they just don't have the skills. Maybe they need some help. It's not always going to work, and it's going to be a real booger whenever it doesn't. It's going to hurt. It's going to be, you got to watch, because that can be a real trigger for burnout. But when you do have those families, that you're able to help support, and you have those parents that you know are struggling through addiction, but they're overcoming it, that feeling and seeing that beautiful transformation in that family, that goes a long way. It goes a very, very long way in helping to sustain you in this work. I want to thank you all for your time today. I really appreciate the conversation that you all have been having in the chat. I've been trying to keep track of some of it as I've been speaking, and I really appreciate it. I would welcome any questions that you all have. I know we only have 3 minutes left. Yes, you will absolutely be able to have my slides. I will get them to Tina or Nancy, and they will send those out to you. I have one quick ask, and I believe this link will be sent out to you as well. Um, we have a survey at that I do this at the end of all of mine. And the reason is it's not to hear, that like it's not to inflate my head. Okay, let me just say that. Um, it is because I literally read these and I want to hear what is something that I should have touched on better? What is something that I need to change? What are your thoughts on it? I learned so much from these feedback surveys. And so, as a bonus, if you take this, it's like 3 questions, it's very easy. If you take this survey, you will then get access to a link that will link you to a Google Drive folder full of information, evidence-based information, and tools that you can use when supporting this population. Nancy, I will hand it back to you.
Okay, I'm in a dual role right now. They just called a meeting that I was clicking into, but I wanted to be sure and hook back on here and tell Megan thank you. And I love this information. I just think it's absolutely dynamite and things that we need to process. So I'm going to tell everybody to please fill out the survey that you'll see pop up. And if it doesn't, it's not me, it's Zoom. It doesn't always cooperate. And please come back to ours. The next one will be in September on September 10th, and Pamela will be doing work on how to access our circle of care on the internet and work with you on how to use it and apply it. So it's going to be really exciting. So I'm going to say have a great, great week and enjoy the fall. And thank you for being here. Thanks,
Yes,
Megan.
you are so welcome. Thank you for the chance, Miss Nancy.
You got it.